much.
And if people would just read the Bible and read the book of Revelations, they would really turn around and straighten up. This is all we need to do, is just get a good book and read it and put it to everyday life.
Hi, my name is Matt Page-Lieberman, and this is a program I have called Almost Everything is More Than Interesting. Today's program is called Black and Non-Religious. It's specifically about a movement that's been going on for perhaps over 100 years. It has to do with people of the so-called Black American community who are not part of the more conventional Black American community, which consists of heavy religious participation and believing that that most that Black people need to rely on in order to better their lots in life has to do with turning towards God. What we're specifically wanting to talk about this program is called Black Humanism, and it can concern people like agnostics, atheists, free thinkers, and secular humanists, amongst other groups, skeptics. A couple of years ago, I moved back to Massachusetts from Brazil, and my father, he's a famous humanist in Florida, he invited me to go to the 30th anniversary of the Harvard chaplaincy. It's for the Harvard Humanist Chaplaincy. So who I have here with me today is one of the very few Black participants. It's my good friend Ken Granderson. Can you?
Hi. Hey, Matt.
Ken,
Glad to be here.
I remember that you spoke about, you got up there and you asked a question, and it was like maybe 200 white people, and I finally thought to myself, wow, finally a Black dude. And you had a particular question you had to ask. Do you remember what it was and what your kind of feelings were about the conference?
Talk about starting off putting me on the spot. No, I don't remember the exact question. I do remember asking a question,
okay.
And I seem to remember it was a couple of people after someone asked a question about why there weren't as many people of color there. Because I think I remember asking my question and saying that I felt like I was the elephant in the middle of the room, so I needed to address the other question. Being, why were there so few? From my recollection, there were 4 Black people in the room. Myself, a personal friend of the organizer of the event, Greg Epstein, who's the chaplain at the Harvard, at the time at Harvard Divinity School, but I believe there was the Humanist Chaplaincy. And Greg is a force to be reckoned with in the overall humanist movement. I'm looking forward to his upcoming book, Being Good Without God, which is a wonderful phrase that describes the moral stances of people whose belief systems would fall into the general category of humanism. So, and when I mentioned there were 4 people, so there was myself, Greg's friend, and then a student of a professor who was there, I believe, getting an award. So, in that very large room, and I really seem to recall it felt like more than 200 people to me.
Right.
Because
quite a few people.
Yeah, my personal guess was that it was more like 400 to 500, but I'm not an expert in guessing crowd numbers.
So perhaps the amount of Black people there were like less than 1%.
Easily for me to believe. I was not surprised. I was disappointed, but not surprised.
So as the time went by, a few months later, we wound up becoming friends. We started regularly meeting up and having particular discussions. One of those discussions has to do with, as a Black man, as a Black person, African American in America, this group tends to be considered a subculture. They're not part of the dominant culture of America. And so, I mean, you and I, we basically consider this a fictitious group. There's really no such thing as far as if it's a gray area, you try to define what exactly is a Black person.
Sure.
How does a Black person?
I can Yes, it's a very confusing topic,
Uh-huh.
and we don't want to get too far off into it. But for instance, I am the descendants of. Well, my grandparents came from Trinidad in the West Indies in the 1920s, so I have no direct connection to the United States slave trade. Yet, I share certain common sensibilities, but then there are others that are not the same.
Yeah.
And so under the big category of, quote, black, you have everyone from Australian Aboriginals, who I shared zero genetic or historical connection to people who may be living in one of the 58 African nations today, to people who came through the slave trade but stayed in the Caribbean and had a different cultural experience than what happened here. And what we find is when you try to put everyone, and of course, obviously, those who have 400 years of ancestry in this country, and because of these distinctions, when you put everyone in one, big, under one umbrella, it's an imperfect term. I use it because you kind of know who you're talking about. And whether you're talking about black people who've been in America for many generations or the West Indies, I can't speak as much about folks who are more closely connected to the African continent just because of my own. I do not have as much personal experience, but within your Afro-Caribbean and African-American communities, religiosity is ubiquitous to the point where it is almost unheard of to be black and not religious.
Yes. And we understand all the diversity within black people of African descent around the world, and even the diversity within Africa, and it's a lot smaller region, like just our nation, the United States of America. There's actually a lot of diversity, but for the dominant culture, or for people that are not part of that group, it's usually considered as one monolithic, the black community.
Right.
So belonging to, as for whatever it may be, you're considered a member of the black community by the dominant group.
Right.
And you're also a critical thinker. You're also a skeptic. You're a lifetime humanist, a secular humanist. So what happens is, I think what we tend to do is believe that first you're a member of a subculture, African American, or from the islands, and then
Black.
within that, you're a skeptic.
Right.
And you're also, we can look at it the converse, and within the skeptic groups, right, which is already a subculture. Being a humanist is definitely not the mainstream majority.
Absolutely
so
not.
you're already in a smaller group, and then you're one of the very few black people within that group. So it becomes a little discomforting, right? You have a lot of experiences where you go to church, anything. God is always present, right? Award shows.
Absolutely, and when you use the phrase that I use as being a lifetime humanist, I'd like to explain that a little bit, but first of all say the word humanist is another umbrella term. So there isn't one specific set of beliefs that says, okay, I'm a humanist. It's a general term for people who don't believe that the universe was created and being controlled by a god or gods. So you've got your agnostics who are not really sure, your atheists who are a little more sure. There are very few atheists who would say, oh, absolutely there is no God, because it is a logical fallacy to be 100% certain about something that would defy any detection. There's the famous Russell's teapot idea. I could say there's this teapot between the Earth and Mars, but it can't be picked up by radar, et cetera, et cetera. You cannot disprove it doesn't exist.
Right.
You cannot prove it does not exist. You can't prove it does exist. Most of us have heard of gods like Zeus, Thor, the Egyptian gods, Amun-Ra, Maat, etc. And in different cultures at different times, these gods were very, very revered, taken very seriously, unlike, say, a Santa Claus.
Right.
But today, we don't believe that they exist. And we don't have to, no one asks us to prove that Zeus does not exist. But if we were back, in the time and place where Zeus was considered, the god, I'm sure we would be asked the same thing. So, the whole idea of people who have belief systems placing the burden of proof, it probably isn't a new thing.
My understanding is you recently came out as an atheist.
Yeah, that was kind of a joke with, I think, Richard Dawkins,
yes.
the author and biologist.
So you don't, don't believe in the god Thor? The god
right, he was sort of as an analogy,
yes.
with a little bit of sarcasm, given that in today's culture no one believes in Thor, the god of thunder, the Norse god of thunder, and he talked about athorists, saying, people who don't believe in Thor, and many of us who in the secular community prefer to use terms like secular
yes.
humanist instead of atheist, because atheist means not atheist, or not someone who does not believe in like in theocracy,
yeah.
or theology, meaning God driven. And so I will. The athorist is trying to make a slightly edgy play on the idea that we do not, just as we don't have to call ourselves athorists to say that we don't believe in Thor, we should not have to define ourselves as atheists just to say that we don't believe in gods, because, as Richard Dawkins says, most of us are atheists to all of the gods, to most of the gods
right.
that have ever been worshipped. Some of us just take it one god further. Now, I wanted actually to go back to the lifetime humanist idea. Like many, if not most, and I say if not because I am not a sociologist, I'm not a scholar or an expert who can quote, study, page number, paragraph, etc. on many of these things. I'm speaking as someone who's a very thoughtful person. I pay attention to things, and I've at this point lived long enough to have acquired a reasonable number of experiences. But I was raised religious in a Protestant Christian denomination called the Church of God, out of Anderson, Indiana. I'd say for those who are not familiar with them, similar to Baptists, not very, very super evangelical like the Pentecostal churches, with speaking in tongues and, a lot of the more, very spirited, very extreme kinds of representations of spirituality, and not as quiet and conservative as I think like the Methodists may be. It's kind of in the middle. But I say that one of the main differences between myself and most other black people that I know who were also raised religious is that I learned to question before I learned to believe. I was exposed to learning very early, and when I read things, because I read the stories and I read the Bible, and there were things that came up that did not make sense. So I asked questions, and I quickly found out that the adults could not answer the questions. In high school, I had the opportunity to take some courses in the Bible, and we read the Bible. But we read it as a book of ancient literature. We also learned a little bit about the political situations going on in that part of the world, in the parts of the world where the texts were written, a little bit about the prevailing theories at the time on where these texts actually came from. This is very different for me in terms of my thinking, because I asked the question, this is one of the questions I would ask, because we were using the King James Bible. I would say, when we go to church, why do we speak in thee, thy, thou, but when we go home, we speak a different way? This was when I was probably pretty young. And I said, if God is everywhere and knows everything, can't he understand us if we talk regular? And I don't ever remember getting a good answer for that. And I mention that because my exposure to the Bible was as one book. This is the book. It is a book. Like it all came together at one point. When you start to study the history of where the text came from, you realize that there are many books written by predominantly unknown authors. And you can get to the point where even when you look at the creation story, there are two of them. Genesis 1:1 to 2:4 has one creation story that has the creation of the world in a certain sequence. And then I believe, and I could be incorrect, again, not a scholar, I think it's chapter 2, verse 4, the creation story starts over. And things happen in a different sequence. And you have the second story, I believe, is the whole Cain and Abel, and I think that one is the rib story, where in the first one, there's a different sequence of events. And it doesn't make sense until you hear what the scholars who've been studying this stuff for a really long time, what they think has happened, which is that you've got documents that have been woven together. And if you look at how the name of God changes from, let's say, God, the Lord. It may have the Lord God. These correlated to different translations in the original, different words in the original Hebrew. And those would pretty much correlate to where different texts started and ended.
Yeah.
And so we read the Bible with that sort of critical analysis. And so I learned so much there that it was very clear to me, it was, as they say, self-evident, that when we look at the Bible, we're looking at the religious and cultural texts of certain somewhat nomadic tribes, that became the ancient nation of Israel. And like every culture has its own, cultural and spiritual belief systems. Some of them are put to writing, some of them are not. I'm very comfortable with seeing the Old Testament as basically the cultural mythology.
It's an artifact.
Yeah,
it's great literature.
Some of it, some of it isn't that great, but we don't even know in many cases what the original texts were, and what we're seeing is something that's been digested a couple of times. There are places where there are large segments of the Bible that are copied, almost verbatim. The time may be different, etc. There are 2 sets of the 10 Commandments.
Yes.
Anything that I'm saying, fortunately, I joke that it's nice to live in the future where you don't have to take a course now anymore. All you have to do is get in front of a computer and Google these things.
Yes.
That if people looked at the second set of 10 Commandments, and it's very clear, and you read the documents, the Lord God, who I won't name, I wouldn't want to offend, some people who don't believe that, the God in the Old Testament should be named.
Okay.
It says, to take the tablets which I break and write, basically, write on them what I told you before. And it's a very different list.
And there are different commandments based on your denomination. Like the Catholics have a different one than the Protestants have.
Right. And we also studied, first of all, we also read the Apocrypha, which were not recognized by the church that I was raised in, but the Catholics, I believe, use it. I don't remember how many books there are, maybe about 7, but could be wrong on that. Books that, so there are some books that are treated as part of the holy canon, the scriptures, the holy word of God, by some groups like the Catholics, and then other groups say no. There were other books that we read that were condemned as heresy. Things like that. I think the Acts of Thomas, maybe, or excuse me, I think it's the Gospel of Thomas. And we learned that there were a lot of books out there.
Yeah. At
the time of the ministry of Jesus, if he existed, and I will say if he existed because when you look at objective historical evidence, and objective historical evidence would be something along the lines of, let's look at whether it's government documents or other writers, are they saying anything about this person? Because if you just look at the people who are writing about a teacher, of course they're going to say, he's the best thing since sliced bread.
Well,
right?
the Romans had really good records, but we have very few records outside of the Gospels about the life of Jesus.
Right. Oh, yeah. I don't think there's anything except the Gospels that talk about the life of Jesus. I think, there are things like one of the classic documents is of a historian named Josephus, which I think was like 100 years later, and then that some reference was later agreed by many, if not most scholars, to be inserted later on. So when you really start studying what people have what they know, because throughout time people have written down a lot of the events, that there were debates over, what is holy, a holy book, what is the holy word of God, what is not. And when you start to look at the individuals who were making these decisions, you think we've got political scandals today. Oh no, we don't hold a candle.
It was something of Nicene.
The Council of Nicaea.
They decided what would be canonized and which would not be accepted.
Exactly.
And we're just supposed to be said, well, they used their best judgment to figure out what was true.
Right. And I'm very comfortable with the idea that with all religions, people are generally sincere, but they're doing the best they could at the time. When we look at holy scriptures, whether it's the Torah / Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, There's nothing in any of these documents which all claim to have come from the architect of the universe, who knows everything. There's nothing in any of those documents that could not have been written by someone from those times.
Yes.
You'd think that, you know, the God that knows everything might have thrown something in there that around 1500, maybe, you know, 1800, maybe year 2000, we say, oh, that's what they were talking about back then. But we live in a world where, you know, you see enough, you know, I mean, if I say things like, okay, if many of the things that people believe because of their religious teachings, if they were true, every now and then, for instance, somebody's amputated limb would just magically reappear. And you can probably guess I'm thinking about one of my favorite websites, whydoesgodhateamputees.com. Right. I mean, point blank, in the Bible it says whatever you ask, you know, will be given unto you. If you have faith the size of a grain of a mustard seed, you can say move the mountain will move, etc., etc. You know, and this is in the New Testament, so you know, maybe our Jewish friends can get by without being under this one, but it's a general principle for religious beliefs of a lot of different religions. That you're saying, okay, you're asking the creator of the universe for something. You know, you're praying and you're saying, look, I'd like this to happen. And my Why Does God Hate Amputees site raises the very simple question. And again, I'm not quoting them. People believe that you can pray and be healed. You can be healed from cancer. You can be healed from AIDS. You can be healed from all sorts of different diseases. But no one has ever come up with a case where someone lost a limb and they prayed and it came back. So what does that mean? Because the Bible, you know, it says whatever you ask. It doesn't say only if you ask things that are easy. And if God made the universe, growing an arm should not be hard. Right? So the website, which is very tongue-in-cheek and it pulls no punches, so if you go to whydoesgodhateamputees.com, be warned. It is, you know, it's not as diplomatic as I am right now. I can be, I will always be polite, but I will never back down. So they raised the question, well, why don't amputees get their prayers answered? Have amputees committed some sin so terrible that God ignores them, et cetera, et cetera? And the idea is that after a while, when you ask enough of those questions, you realize it doesn't really add up. The whole idea of you pray for something and maybe God answers it, maybe God says no, or maybe God says wait. They have a video on that website where they say, well, you can pray to anything and you'll get those three same outcomes. So there is no objective reason to believe that, you know, that these prayers are actually changing.
So Kenny, you're very well skilled at critical thinking, and you've obviously developed the tools through you know, schooling and your experience. Obviously, you know, an aptitude to question this all of these things that are constantly being told to you through your life, like in the community. You know, it's like this, you know, it's like this. And so one of the things that you try to hope to get across to people is the value to their lives, right? If they're
Absolutely.
to kind of learn the skills that you've developed, you know?
Well, to me, the ultimate value is learning how to deal with real life on real life's terms. Wishing for things, hoping for things, quote, waiting on the Lord, at least from my perspective. If anyone can give me some statistics to show it, I'm happy to be proven wrong, but it does not lead to better much of anything. I mean, there are studies that now show when we look at quality of life indicators, you know, whether it's, sickness, teenage pregnancies, domestic violence, whatever, our more religious areas and countries are doing much worse than areas that have much less levels of religiosity. I don't know exactly why. I don't think anyone can say why, but my experience is that the act of looking outside of yourself to solve your problems and take care of things often results in less personal responsibility and less personal action. And so, I mean, we've all been at points where we don't have any idea, you know, what to do, and then I understand why people want to believe that there's some force out there that can make things right, that can get them through. I understand that. And one of the challenges that the secular community has is that we can't offer you anything better.
Yes.
You know, we can't say, no, the cavalry isn't necessarily going to come over the hill and save you. You know, no, the superhero isn't going to show up. You know, no, God is not going to step in. You know, we come from.
Well, we don't offer an alternative saving force.
Right.
What we offer are the skills, so we learn how to confront problems by ourselves.
Right, and at least in my personal experience, or I'll say my belief, because I haven't done statistical analysis to say this is an absolute fact, but certainly my life seems to me that I'm better able to manage different situations in my life because I don't have these expectations, for instance, that things are just going to work out because I prayed and God is going to change other people's minds or change physical events based on my asking.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm pretty happy with life. I'm pretty happy with the fact that things don't work that way, because if I were to believe that God did answer prayer, then I would also have to believe that right now, as we're here in America, in you know, like a very pretty comfortable country, that God is choosing to ignore the desperate pleas of people who are suffering from everything that we don't even want to think about here. You know, they're praying too.
Right.
They really need help. And for me, if I were to believe that God answers the prayer of the very comfortable American who's looking for, you know, a second car, then that God is simultaneously ignoring the pleas of people all over the world who are living lives that we can hardly imagine. And I would not want to live in a universe run by a deity like that.
You know, one thing that we talk about are these award shows and or sports things. People praying to God, you know, please let me make this touchdown.
Right.
You know, please let me succeed against my adversary. Or in award shows, a lot of times you're talking about, you saw the most recent BET show. Was it
I didn't
oh,
see,
not that one, but
no,
previous ones, right?
No, I can't stomach the BET
But you were
show.
telling me about some Black Award shows you watched.
No, this is actually, I think you're talking about the 2007 ALMA Awards. Which
right.
Which were the Latinos in the media. I think
Right,
it was
but you
TV
had
and
compared
film.
it with...
Right. Well, here's the observation that I made. Yes, generally when you have black people in various situations where they get awards, you know, in this country we award people, you know, for entertaining, you know, in sports and, you know, in different artistic, you know, creative kinds of things. It is very commonplace. And again, I haven't done stats, but to say that it almost always happens, it feels that way, but hey, I might be extra sensitive. I welcome people to look at the stats and let the facts, you know, let the facts tell the story, because I could be wrong about anything I'm saying, always ready to be proven wrong. Okay. But it's very common to see a black person, you know, want to thank God. You know, it could be someone whose, you know, latest record, you know, was, you know, I want to shoot everyone on my block, you know, and they will want to thank God.
Yeah.
And people seem to be okay with this. That's another topic. But with the ALMA Awards, what struck me, because I expected to see that.
And what ALMA Awards is?
I don't know what the ALMA...
But it's Latino.
Latino
Americans.
Yes, definitely Latino Americans. But what I noticed was that every single awardee, every single one, thanked their parents. And I don't think any of them went religious. I don't think any of them said, you know, thank you, God. Now, you know, this could be because, you know, most of your Latino countries, if not all, you know, being colonized by the Spanish, very Catholic.
Yeah.
It might be a Catholic cultural thing. I'm willing to accept that.
Yeah.
You know, I don't have any grand conclusion, but I noticed just such a strong cultural distinction in terms of the way that folks from the different countries that, you know, fall under the banner, we're dealing with another, you know, blanket term for different cultures, et cetera, you know, of Latino. That they did not have this hyper religiosity, and that you see from different variety, you know, different you know, subgroups within the banner of black. And I've had the experience when talking with, you know, quote, white people, you know, folks, you know, primarily European descent. In many cases, if not most cases, they don't understand that it's a very different cultural experience.
Yeah.
Because I believe you were born in a family that was secular, correct?
Yeah, sure was.
Yeah. You weren't going to church every Sunday, going to choir practice, being involved in this. I went on youth conventions that actually exposed me to different cities. I came to Boston. I'm not going to say it was bad. The people were great people. The biggest thing we had to worry about in our church was crotchety old ladies. I mean, they were salt of the earth people. I love them. They are wonderful people. I just believe that they're latched onto a set of beliefs that have served their purpose in every culture. But I think that we're at a point in human history where just as a child gets to a point where they can put aside the Santa Claus idea, the big guy who's going to be good to you, you're going to give you nice things if you're good and give you a lump of coal, punish you if you're bad. I think as a human race and as different cultures within the human race, we're at a point where we know how to control enough things in our environment. We don't need to pray to the sun gods or pray to the rain gods and all, because that's where a lot of religious beliefs come from, this idea that, how are we going to survive? Okay, we don't know, let's ask. We're at a point now where we've figured out enough things that we can live pretty comfortable lives without having to, believe that there's someone who's going to make things okay for us. I believe we've evolved enough as a race, as a human race, that in order for us to be good people, we don't need to say, oh, we must follow a rule book that says, don't kill. Every culture, regardless of their different belief systems, figured that out, and we talk closely enough with each other as a human race now that, we can be good without having these kinds of rules, which, when it gets down to it, if you really look at the different religious rules, they're almost impossible to live by in our society. I believe there's a guy who tried to live by them for a year, like the Mosaic laws, and
I heard about this a few years ago, right?
Yeah. And I don't know if he was doing it just to demonstrate or if he was a devout believer, etc. But when you really look at certain things that are in the text, and try to apply them to today, it doesn't work.
Well, as I remember, he was a skeptic, and he was trying to prove just how ludicrous it was to have these types of expectations, especially of these conflicting things.
Yeah.
That one must live his life. So what you're saying, that a lot of us, we understand this now, and we do not need to, we're not in an era anymore where we need to rely on a supernatural thing to help us change these things in our lives, to help us, we rely on medicine rather than praying. We rely on our hard work for something like work rather than money falling out of the sky. But in certain communities, and this is something that Sikivu Hutchinson, we're also going to talk about, who she said recently that in the black community, saying you're an atheist is like you're creating yourself persona non grata. She says that, and as far as how much homosexuality is a taboo subject, and a lot of people are not. To say you're an atheist, and in American polls, we have this thing that the very lowest thing of the biggest concept, the biggest identity that people are objecting to before voting for a presidential candidate is if he's an atheist. In the black community, it's not even like it's a very serious. It's not just running for president; it's about being a member of your community. And so we want to talk about is coming out, right? Coming out of the closet. What we have is Norm Allen Jr. He's the executive director of African American Humanists, or Africans Americans for Humanism, and he wrote an article around 2002, about black atheists coming out of the closet, which I only came across recently. What came across recently was about 2 months ago in the LA Watts Times. Sikivu Hutchinson, she wrote this thing, and it was a really interesting thing. She writes that it's coming out of the closet, and perhaps today we're a little bit more receptive. Just like 7 years later or 5 years later, we're a little bit more receptive. Now, she had a follow-up interview in Alternate, and she kind of she explained some of these things about, say like white atheists, not quite, they're kind of criticizing how backwards, quote unquote, backwards black people are because they believe this and that, and without really understanding the kind of liberation theology behind it. Why would black people be needing religion? Why would they be looking towards God to come out of the shackles? Whereas white people, it's kind of, they can choose to believe it or not. It's not so intrinsic to being accepted as part of your community.
Right.
Right? So, you read that article, right?
Yeah, and, sorry for the repeated disclaimers, I'm not a sociologist.
Right, you're not even a representative of any group or anything like that.
I represent me.
But you have the experiences.
Yeah. And the theme of, God as a liberator comes up in different religions, and it makes sense because, while we've mentioned a few times about under the banner of black, you have people who come from different countries, who have different cultural experiences. Something that is shared, unfortunately, is, generally is a history of oppression. And so there are things in the Bible, like a lot of folks will focus on, the Exodus story, that the Jewish culture, uses as its liberation, the whole liberation story. And there are many versions of religious belief in the black community, and I say versions because I believe it's both in Christianity and also in the Nation of Islam that makes analogies, or sometimes may even say that this is supposed to be prophesying the whole idea of blacks in slavery, and and I think it works. It works because it has a happy ending.
Right.
If the story ended up differently, I don't think it would be such a compelling thing to latch on to. And so it's a compelling.
Well, no, you told me about a conference that's coming up this fall.
Down in Atlanta.
Okay, now what is that?
A first conference of black. It may say black atheists or black non-theists. Okay, yeah. I avoid the A word frequently because for a few reasons. That number one, it is one of those hot button words. An analogy I use sometimes is the word militant.
Yeah.
If you use the word militant, many people, there's just a lot of baggage that comes with it.
Right.
Whereas sometimes if you talk to someone who self-identifies as a militant, you find out, what? No, they're not some, yahoos trying to take over the government. They're, in many cases might be just looking for, equal sorts of treatment and things, and willing to, like the U.S., say, like, look on New Hampshire, live free and die,
Sometimes it's just like radical chic, and they're youngsters.
That too.
But with the atheist word, we're like, I think by avoiding that, the big A word, we're basically redefining. We're like saying we're not going to let, the dominant group tell us that we should be labeled as being against to what they think is reasonable.
Right.
We're not eccentric because we do not believe in this stuff.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
We're just
rational
thinkers.
In my view is, we are all born atheists. While there are studies that suggest that children, who have not been influenced by external society, do have a tendency to believe in some sort of being behind things, making things happen. The prevailing thoughts, at least in terms of what I've read, and maybe people who say other things, the reason behind that is that generally, when you think of it as a survival skill, if something's moving, it's safer to think, might be a tiger, than to say, there's nothing to it, because every now and then it is a tiger, and so the people who tend not to think that it's a tiger ended up in the tiger's bellies. The ones who said, even when it was the wind, said it's a tiger, they had kids. And they taught their kids to be scared of when it, So while even though there is this tendency to think that there may be something behind things, to get to the point of believing in Jesus, Buddha, Allah, and yes, Buddhism isn't a religion specifically, but I'm just saying, any of these specific figures in religions or belief systems, that only comes because somebody told you that was the case.
Yeah.
So you start off with sort of like a blank slate. Any religion that you claim, you got that from someone. So from my perspective, coming to a point where you say, you know what, I don't believe in, pick the deity of your choice. That isn't like a conversion to a new religion. That's just getting back to where you started.
Yeah, there's an expression I read recently, I've said it a few times, is the more people agree, like, on the line with every single thing, the more likely that they're just not even thinking for themselves. I didn't word it.
Well, sure.
And when we're not all naturally going to come to the same conclusion, there's a Jesus of salvation. These are stories that are,
Absolutely.
You're submitting. You're saying, there's a point in which you say, it's like watching a movie, is what the willful disbelief, or what is it, of suspension of disbelief.
Like when you watch James Bond, and you say,
no.
Yeah, I know, they're really good.
No, but my brother-in-law, he would defend a lot of movies that I thought were too silly.
Okay.
You have to be more willing to suspend your disbelief. But for many people, there is a point in which what is in these stories, they are so outlandish. Like, I just can't suspend it anymore.
Sure.
I really have to think this out. I really have to question this.
Sure.
So what is interesting is that, what I wanted to say is that we know there are a lot of people that they just don't believe that there's a giant puppet master, but they tend not to perhaps join groups. They're very independent thinkers.
Absolutely.
Or they don't belong to groups. But what you find out is that they could be very, very alone. Mm-hmm. And rather than thinking of ourselves in a subgroup within a subgroup, perhaps it's better to think of ourselves as two groups that are converging. An intersection of, say, like, Black America. Dan, are you hearing this? And skeptics and atheists and agnostics. So I guess we had a nice graphic.
Oh, I'm sure it'll come up. Sure.
But we had, for many of us that don't know what's going on in our history, it seems like they're just kind of, the ends are just touching each other. But when we really take a look back and the historical figures, you could bring up the next one. We have like W.E. Du Bois. We've got A. Philip Randolph. We've got many people at Harlem Renaissance contributors. Norm Allen Jr., the executive director. You've got C.Q. Hutchinson, who just recently wrote this article. Many civil rights leaders we don't even know about. And then other community members, maybe people right down the street. So we're trying to say it's safe. It's safe to come out. And by doing this, more African Americans can have like a say in these traditionally like white-dominated skeptic groups here in America, humanist groups, rational. And more skeptics and rational people can have more of an influence on the dominant African-American culture, We hope that we can kind of open up this, right? To make it a lot more comfortable for everybody to be reasonable, and speak your mind. You can come out of the closet.
Absolutely. Absolutely. While I haven't graduated to the point of imagining that an influx of Black humanists, atheists, agnostics, et cetera, will influence the secular communities, I'm sure it would. I'm still at the point of being happy to run into other Black people who are not, some sort of theist, who are okay with not knowing what happens when you die, with not thinking that there is a grand design, a grand plan behind everything.
So what would, if somebody wanted to get in more touch with you, like people want to contact you for more information, you have something you could use?
The easiest way at this point would just be to find me on Facebook, because there are quite a few links I can share with people, and that I do frequently. There's one Black atheist who's been doing online radio shows for the past decade. The Infidel Guy, Reggie Findley. He's at infideldie.com. There are other online radio shows that talk about different aspects of secular thinking, and a few on Black humanism, Black atheism, etc. But the easiest way to find me would be on Facebook, www.facebook.com/Mr. Ken. Yeah.
So I guess it's been. I hope it's been really informative for everybody. I think we have a lot of time. There's a lot that we want to cover. I expect to have you on again, right?
Oh,
we're going to talk a lot more about the history and other people. We'll have media and stuff like that, and we'll throw it up online. Anything other that's on your mind that?
I think just I guess we're closing up now because the time has flown by.
Yeah.
It goes by really fast. I would like to end with some of what you were saying, that it's okay to not be religious. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person. You can be a very moral person. You can be a very kind-hearted, compassionate person, and not have to believe in a God. And so, again, the URL is the best way to get in touch with me. There's lots of information we can share, and thanks a lot for having me, Matt.
I'm Matt Page-Lieberman, and this has been my program on being black and non-religious. Kenny came up with the title. Ken came up with the title. And this is my good friend Ken Granderson. And I'm really thankful you came out to educate the public, Ken.
Thanks for inviting me, man, anytime.
Okay. So until next time, thank you for joining us.
As I look into my cosmic microscope, I see things that words is too vast to be found. For the color of my smile has constructed a new style. Me, myself, and I are positively bound. Congratulations are in order for the light that has caused the times to stop and cleanse my stain. My vibration time recedes, and it's hard to find the need to create the disease of the lower plane. Let me tell you, will you please take a listen? Won't you take a listen? Don't know what you're missing. Check it out. I'm not a freak for religion. Find out all about. Explore. Be free of constriction. You must be aware that there's magic in the air. We all are solar angels. There's no burden to bear. With a little help, we shall find each other there. To keep the truth from you would be unfair. Seek the triumph, seek it, you shall find. Triumph, baby. In the words of a famous man, if you don't change, you will make me feel strange. If you're not satisfied, why not make a change? Triumph! What I say, child, honey, child. Triumph. You deserve a break today, Baba. We should have learned by now. I'll show you how. I'll show you how. Just look up, the time is now. Salutations, good to meet you on these terms. Since I've been gone, I hope that you have learned. If you find you need a light, please believe the time is right. Let me tell you all exactly why I burn. I burn. Balance is the key to inner peace and happiness. Know the forces that become involved. Perhaps you'll search the trail. Maybe you will. Perhaps you'll choose the tale. If you never try, you never shall evolve. Oh yeah. Will you please take a listen to me? You don't know what you don't have to agree. I'm not a freak for religion. That should be plain to see. Don't me free. Yeah. But there's magic in the air. We all are solar